The stars twinkled above the campsite, a quiet reminder of how far humanity had come. Jack sighed, leaning back against the worn fabric of his camping chair. It had been a long day of hiking, and the serenity of this alien planet Zerones felt like a well-earned reward. The air was crisp, the smell of alien flowers faintly sweet, and his only company was the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. For a brief moment, everything was perfect. Then it happened. The zipper of his tent rattled furiously, and before Jack could react, a figure crawled inside, silhouetted against the dim light of the campfire. His mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. The figure, unmistakably not human, moved with a clumsy determination, her long, pale limbs folding awkwardly to fit into the confined space. She settled cross-legged in front of him, completely unbothered by his stunned expression. "Greetings, human male," she said cheerily, her voice resonating with an odd, melodic tone. "I am Navek, esteemed anthropologist of the Zeronian Research Institute. I have come to perform your sacred ritual of bonding." Jack blinked. "You what?" Navek straightened her back, her luminous blue eyes narrowing with determination. "I studied your customs extensively. The texts were very clear. It begins with the removal of unnecessary coverings." She gestured to herself, entirely void of clothing, as if this explained everything. Jack's brain short-circuited. "Oh, for the love of, what texts?" She produced a worn manual from behind her back. The cover read, Human Camping Traditions, 3rd edition. It looked suspiciously like a poorly translated novelty book. "Where did you even get that?" Jack asked, rubbing his temples. "An esteemed vendor on your intergalactic market. He assured me it was authentic," Navek said proudly. She leaned closer, flipping through pages filled with absurd illustrations of humans roasting marshmallows, dancing around fires, and, apparently, conducting what looked like group saunas in the nude. Jack let out a strangled laugh. "Oh, this is rich. You've been scammed, Navek. Camping isn't, look, humans don't." He paused, searching for the right words. "We don't do this when we camp." Navek tilted her head, confusion etched across her delicate, bioluminescent features. "But why would your texts lie? Is deception not a violation of your moral codes?" Jack sighed. "It's not lying, it's satire. Meant to be funny." "Ah, humor! Fascinating!" Navek brightened immediately, misinterpreting his exasperation as amusement. "Then I shall partake in your humor. Proceed with the ritual." "There's no ritual." Jack threw up his hands. "This is just camping, simple, quiet, clothed camping." He gestured vaguely at the extra blanket in the corner of the tent. "Could you at least, I don't know, cover up or something?" Navek glanced at the blanket, then back at Jack, her expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "But why? Your species clearly embraces the natural form in these settings. It says so right here." She tapped a particularly ridiculous illustration of a group of humans laughing naked in a hot spring. Jack groaned. "We don't just, ugh, never mind. Forget the book. Forget the ritual. Let's start over. Hi, I'm Jack. I like clothes. Nice to meet you." Navek studied him for a long moment, her brow furrowing. "I believe I understand," she said finally. "This is a test of endurance, yes? To see how long one can withstand the discomfort of unnecessary layers." "No!" Jack barked, his face heating as he desperately tried to steer the conversation back to normalcy. "It's just a preference. Like how you prefer, whatever it is your species prefers. We prefer efficiency," Navek said with a small nod. "This is why I am here to learn from you, Jack. I have devoted my life to understanding the peculiar ways of your kind. For example," she added, gesturing to the campfire outside, "the act of placing food on sticks. Truly ingenious." Jack stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "It's just marshmallows. And yet it symbolizes so much," Navek said, her voice soft with awe. "Unity. Simplicity. The enduring spirit of survival. It symbolizes sugar." Jack muttered, but the alien's enthusiasm was almost endearing. Almost. Navek's gaze wandered around the tent, her eyes lighting up as they landed on Jack's flashlight. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. And this device, a beacon of your technological prowess. It's a flashlight. Navek clicked it on, then immediately dropped it with a startled yelp as the beam of light hit the ceiling. Incredible! A weapon of illumination! Jack chuckled despite himself. Sure, let's go with that. As Navek continued to marvel at the mundane contents of his tent, Jack found himself softening toward her. She was eccentric, no doubt about it, but there was something oddly charming about her earnestness. So, he said finally, leaning back against his sleeping bag. You're really an anthropologist? Navek nodded vigorously. The finest of my cohort. Though, admittedly, my methods are unorthodox. No kidding, Jack said, smirking. Navek beamed, clearly taking it as a compliment. Then I shall continue my observations. Tonight, I will study the sacred art of human rest. Jack opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. There was no point in arguing. He pulled the blanket over his head and mumbled. Fine. Just stay on your side of the tent. Understood, Navek said solemnly, already jotting notes in her little research manual. Jack sighed. It was going to be a long night. The silence of the camp was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of alien insects. Jack lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, wondering how he had ended up sharing a space with an overzealous alien anthropologist. Navek, meanwhile, was still meticulously scribbling notes in her manual, her glowing eyes darting between Jack and various objects in the tent. You're not actually going to write down everything, are you? Jack asked, propping himself up on one elbow. Of course, Navek replied without looking up. Every detail matters. For instance, the way you have positioned your bedding suggests an aversion to direct ground contact. Fascinating. It's called comfort, Jack said, his voice laced with sarcasm. You should try it sometime. Navek paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. Comfort. An intriguing concept. Is this also why humans place such emphasis on clothing? To achieve comfort? Jack groaned. Yes. Among other things. Like modesty. Modesty. She repeated the word slowly, as though tasting it for the first time. A peculiar trait. On Zerones, we find it inefficient to obscure our forms unless the environment demands it. Well, Earth isn't Zerones, Jack muttered. Navek's expression brightened. Precisely. That's why I'm here, to immerse myself in your traditions. For example, she pointed to his jacket, which was draped over a nearby chair. This garment. Is it ceremonial? Jack blinked. It's a jacket. And its function? To keep warm. Navek leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And yet you are not wearing it. Does this signify rebellion against the cold? Jack couldn't help but laugh. No, it signifies that it's not cold right now. You're really overthinking this. Overthinking, she mused, scribbling furiously in her notes. Another human trait. Fascinating. Jack rolled his eyes but found himself oddly entertained by her relentless curiosity. You know, he said, for someone who claims to study humans, you're really bad at understanding them. On the contrary, Navek said, looking genuinely offended. My methods are revolutionary. Immersive observation is far superior to passive data collection. If you say so, Jack replied, smirking. Navek suddenly sat up straighter, her expression turning serious. Speaking of observation, I must inquire about your mating rituals. Jack choked on his laugh. Excuse me? It is a critical aspect of understanding your species, Navek explained earnestly. According to my research, humans engage in elaborate courtship behaviors involving offerings of sustenance, synchronized movements, and auditory signals. Jack stared at her. Are you talking about dinner dates and dancing? Navek nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. Precisely. Would you care to demonstrate? Jack shook his head, fighting back a grin. Sorry, but I left my dancing shoes at home. Navek frowned, clearly disappointed. A missed opportunity. Very well, I shall rely on secondary sources. Good luck with that, Jack said, chuckling. Navek fell silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the campfire outside. When she spoke again, her tone was softer. Do you ever feel isolated, Jack? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Your species is known for its independence, she said. Yet, paradoxically, you seem to crave connection. It's a curious contradiction. Jack thought about it for a moment. I guess that's just part of being human. We like our space, but we don't want to be alone. Navek nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Zeronians are quite different. We value unity above all else. Individualism is rare. That explains a lot, Jack said, smirking. Navek smiled, a faint blush coloring her bioluminescent cheeks. Perhaps our species have more in common than I realized. Jack leaned back, a genuine warmth creeping into his voice. Maybe. But if you really want to understand humans, you'll need to stop relying on those ridiculous books. Navek laughed, a soft, musical sound that seemed to lighten the air around them. Agreed. Perhaps you could teach me instead. Jack raised an eyebrow. You want me to be your human guide? Why not? She said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. You're already an excellent source of data. Jack chuckled. Well, I guess I could use the company. Just try not to crawl into anyone else's tent, okay? Navek grinned, her sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. I make no promises. Jack shook his head, but he couldn't hide his smile. It was going to be an interesting expedition. Jack woke up to the sound of shuffling outside the tent. For a moment, he thought Navek had finally decided to explore on her own. But when the zipper moved, his heart sank. She ducked back inside, holding what looked like a bundle of alien plant stems, and was that his cookware? Jack! I have prepared the next phase of your bonding ritual. Rubbing his face, Jack sat up, half expecting another bizarre misunderstanding. What now? These! Navek declared triumphantly, holding up the plant stems. The book says humans wave objects to ward off spirits before consuming their ceremonial nourishment. I gathered these for us. Jack squinted at the bundle, trying not to laugh. Those are weeds. And spirits? We don't. Okay, what part of your book said this? Navek flipped to a heavily annotated page and pointed at a poorly drawn illustration of humans roasting marshmallows while holding sticks in the air. Here. That's just waving marshmallows over a fire. It's cooking, not a ritual. Navek stared at him, clearly baffled. You mean to say that you do not invoke protection before consuming your sustenance? That seems reckless. Only if you're cooking something poisonous, Jack said dryly. Navek tilted her head. Fascinating. Humans must have extraordinary immunity to danger. Jack groaned. Yeah, sure, let's go with that. She dropped the weeds and carefully set the cookware down as if she were presenting a royal offering. I've also observed that humans take great pride in their tools. Would you like to explain the symbolic significance of these items? Jack stared at the pot and pan she'd arranged ceremoniously. Symbolic? They're just for cooking. You know, to heat food, make it edible? Navek clapped her hands together. A transformation ritual. You convert raw matter into sustenance using fire, much like our ancestors. Truly remarkable. Remarkable, Jack repeated flatly, running a hand through his hair. And your ceremonial attire, she continued, pointing to his tattered hiking boots. These coverings, are they trophies from previous expeditions? Jack laughed despite himself. No, they're just boots. For walking. Functional and symbolic, Navek said, jotting this down in her notes. Jack leaned back, watching her with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Do you ever take a break from analyzing everything? Navek looked genuinely confused. Why would I? Understanding your species is my mission. Well, maybe try experiencing things instead of overthinking them, Jack suggested. Navek tapped her chin, considering his words. Experience, interesting. Perhaps you could demonstrate. Jack raised an eyebrow. Demonstrate what? How humans enjoy themselves. Jack blinked. I'm not even sure where to start with that one. She gestured toward the campfire. The book implies that communal activities are central to human bonding. Shall we attempt one? Against his better judgment, Jack sighed and grabbed a stick. Fine. Let's roast marshmallows. No spirits involved, okay? Navek eagerly mimicked him, her first attempt at skewering a marshmallow resulting in it flying off the stick and landing in the dirt. Ah. I see. Precision is key. Jack chuckled, guiding her through the process. It's not that hard. Just hold it over the flame and don't let it catch fire. Navek's marshmallow promptly burst into flames. She yelped, waving it around until it extinguished itself in a charred, gooey mess. Well, Jack said, biting back laughter. You technically cooked it. Navek stared at the blackened marshmallow, and then at Jack. To his surprise, she started laughing, a melodic, contagious sound that made it impossible not to join in. You humans have such peculiar rituals, she said between giggles. But I must admit they are enjoyable. See? Told you, Jack said, grinning. Their laughter subsided, and Navek's gaze turned thoughtful. Jack, do you ever feel misunderstood by your own kind? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? You said I overthink, she explained. But I wonder if humans misunderstand your desire for solitude. Perhaps they mistake it for isolation, when in fact you simply value independence. Jack hesitated, her words hitting closer to home than he expected. Yeah, maybe. I guess it's hard to explain sometimes. Navek nodded, her expression softening. It is not so different for me. My colleagues often dismiss my methods as eccentric. But I believe understanding requires immersion, even if it means making mistakes. Jack smiled faintly. Well, you're definitely good at immersion. Navek's lips curled into a grin. And you are surprisingly patient for a species known for its impulsivity. Surprisingly? Jack teased. Exceptionally, she amended, her tone playful. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the campfire crackling softly between them. For the first time, Jack felt like he wasn't just tolerating her presence, he was enjoying it. Navek, he said finally, you're not half as bad as I thought. She beamed. And you are far more fascinating than I expected. Jack chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. As you should, she replied, her eyes gleaming mischievously. Jack shook his head, a genuine smile tugging at his lips. Maybe this wasn't such a bad camping trip after all. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange light across the campsite. Jack leaned back, letting the warmth wash over him. Navek sat cross-legged on the ground, still holding the charred remains of her marshmallow experiment. She seemed unbothered, her focus now on a small, smooth object she had pulled from her satchel. What's that? Jack asked, nodding toward the object. Navek held it up proudly. A Zeronian bonding stone. It is customary to exchange one with those we find significant. Jack raised an eyebrow. Significant, huh? And what do you do with it? You keep it, she said simply. As a reminder of the bond. Jack chuckled. You're really leaning into this bonding thing, aren't you? Navek tilted her head, considering his words. Is that not what humans value? Bonds, connections, shared experiences? Well, yeah, but we don't usually hand out rocks to prove it. Navek frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. Perhaps I misunderstood. Is there an equivalent human gesture? Jack thought for a moment, then smirked. Depends on the situation. Sometimes it's a handshake. Sometimes it's a hug. And sometimes it's, more complicated. Complicated how? Navek asked, her curiosity immediately piqued. Jack waved her off. Never mind. Let's stick with the rock. Navek smiled, holding the stone out to him. Then consider this a token of my admiration. Jack hesitated but eventually took the stone, its surface cool and smooth in his palm. Thanks, I guess. Navek beamed, clearly pleased with herself. And what will you offer in return? Jack blinked. Wait, this is a two-way thing? Of course, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. Jack looked around the campsite, his mind racing. Finally, he grabbed his flashlight and held it out. Here. A human bonding tool. Navek took the flashlight with reverence, examining it closely. A device of great utility, she murmured. Your generosity is noted, Jack. Jack rolled his eyes but couldn't help smiling. Glad you approve. Navek placed the flashlight carefully in her satchel before turning her attention back to him. Jack, may I ask you something personal? He shrugged. Sure, why not? Do you think your species will ever truly understand mine? Jack considered the question, the weight of it cutting through the light-hearted atmosphere. Honestly? Probably not. But that doesn't mean we can't try. Navek nodded slowly, her expression unusually serious. And do you believe we can understand you? Jack smirked. Well, you're off to a weird start, but yeah, I think it's possible. Navek smiled, her gaze softening. Then perhaps there is hope for us yet. They fell into a comfortable silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Jack found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. Navek's presence, while chaotic, was strangely calming now. Jack, she said after a while, her voice hesitant. I must confess something. He raised an eyebrow. What is it? I was not entirely honest about my methods, she admitted, her cheeks glowing faintly. Jack leaned forward, intrigued. Oh? Do tell. My superiors, they consider me unconventional. They do not approve of my immersion techniques. I fear they will view this mission as another failure. Jack frowned. Why? You're out here learning, aren't you? Yes, but my results are often misinterpreted, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Jack shrugged. Sounds like their problem, not yours. If they can't see the value in what you're doing, that's on them. Navek blinked, clearly surprised by his response. You truly believe that? Yeah, Jack said firmly. You're weird, Navek, but you're doing something most people wouldn't even try. That counts for something. A small smile tugged at her lips. Thank you, Jack. Your words mean more than you know. Jack grinned. Don't mention it. Just don't crawl into anyone else's tent uninvited, okay? Navek laughed, the sound light and genuine. I will make a note of that. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and soon they were exchanging stories about their respective worlds. Navek recounted tales of Zeronian festivals and their bizarre rituals, while Jack shared anecdotes from his hiking adventures, complete with exaggerated details that left Navek in stitches. By the time the fire had nearly died out, Jack felt a strange sense of camaraderie with his alien companion. She was unconventional, sure, but there was something undeniably endearing about her curiosity and determination. As they prepared to settle in for the night, Navek looked at him with a mischievous glint in her eye. Jack, if I may propose one final observation, he groaned. What now? Would you consider allowing me to study the concept of a human hug? Jack laughed, shaking his head. You really don't give up, do you? Not when it comes to research, she replied, her tone teasing. With a resigned smile, Jack stood and extended his arms. Fine. One hug. For science. Navek stepped forward, her movements hesitant at first. When their arms wrapped around each other, she froze briefly before relaxing. This is surprisingly pleasant, she admitted. Yeah, well, don't get used to it, Jack said, patting her back awkwardly. She pulled away, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Jack. This has been an enlightening experience. Glad I could help, he said, smirking. As they settled back into the tent, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, this trip hadn't been such a disaster after all.